The young boy walked into the music academy with quiet steps, almost as if he didn't want anyone to notice him. He held his hands close to his chest, the way children do when they feel unsure in a new place. The academy building was big, with long hallways and shiny wooden floors that echoed with the soft sounds of piano practice coming from different rooms. Students wearing neat uniforms passed by him, carrying sheet music and talking excitedly about their lessons. But the boy didn't say anything. He only looked around silently, taking in everything like a sponge. He had never been in a place like this before. At home, the only piano he had ever seen was an old keyboard someone had given his mother years ago. It had a few broken keys, but to him, it was a treasure. He spent hours pressing the keys not because he knew how to play, but because he loved the sound and loved how patterns formed when his fingers moved. Music, for him, was not just sound, it was something he could feel in his mind. Something that made sense like a puzzle. When he entered the main practice hall, he saw a huge black grand piano placed in the center of the room. Its glossy surface reflected the lights above, making it look almost magical. The boy stopped walking and stared at it as if it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He slowly walked closer, almost afraid he might damage it just by looking at it too long. The professor, an older woman known for her strict teaching style, watched him from a distance. She didn't show much emotion, but inside she wondered about him. The academy had many talented students, some with years of training. But this boy? He had no formal lessons, no certificates, no competitions. Nothing. He had simply appeared one day, brought by a family friend who said, "He learns fast. He's special. Just give him a chance." The professor wasn't convinced. Many people claimed their children were special. Yet most time, it turned out to be ordinary talent or simple enthusiasm. But something about this boy made her look twice. He didn't walk around touching everything or asking questions like other kids. He didn't behave overly excited or scared. Instead, he watched things deeply, almost as if his eyes were studying every corner of the room, every piece of the piano, every sound floating in the air. Several other students sat across the room, practicing their scales, chatting, or warming up their fingers. When they noticed the boy, they whispered among themselves. New students always got attention, especially when they looked shy. One girl with bright red hair whispered to her friend, "Does he even know how to play? Why is he just staring at the piano like that?" They giggled softly, but the boy didn't notice. His focus was entirely fixed on the instrument. The professor called him over. "Come here," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. The boy walked slowly toward her and stood quietly. She looked at him closely, trying to read something in his eyes. Maybe fear? Maybe excitement? But what she saw was something else, curiosity. Deep, quiet, and sharp. She pointed at the bench. "Sit, let's see what you can do." The boy nodded and sat down. His small feet barely touched the ground, and the piano keys looked big in front of him. He didn't place his fingers on the keys immediately. Instead, he hovered his hands above them, feeling the space between the notes. It was a habit he had developed at home, something that helped him sense patterns before he made any sound. The professor observed him closely. Most children jumped into playing something, even if it was wrong. But this boy took his time, studying the instrument as if it were a complex machine he was trying to understand. Finally, he pressed a single key. A soft, pure note filled the room. He listened carefully, almost measuring the sound. Then he pressed another key, slightly higher. Again, he listened. He wasn't playing a song. He was understanding the piano's voice. Slowly, the professor began to feel a shift inside her. She had watched countless beginners touch the piano. Some pressed the keys too hard. Others hesitated too much. But this boy wasn't doing either. He was listening. Truly listening. And that was unusual for someone with no training. The red-haired girl and her friends stopped giggling. They watched him now, puzzled by how serious he looked. Another student, a boy who had been practicing for years, frowned a little. He didn't like that a newcomer was suddenly getting so much attention, but the boy wasn't aware of any of this. In that moment, the only thing that mattered to him was the piano, the way each key carried its own weight, its own vibration, its own meaning. It was like discovering a new language. Yet somehow, knowing exactly how to understand it, the professor crossed her arms, now more curious than skeptical. She didn't know yet who this boy truly was or what he was capable of. But she felt something unusual in the air, as if the room had quietly shifted, and it all began with a single, soft note played by a boy who didn't yet realize he was different, special. In a way the professor had never seen before, the professor watched the boy for another long moment, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. She had spent more than 20 years teaching music, and in all that time, she had learned to read a student by the way they touched the piano. Some were confident, some were careless, some were nervous, and a few were truly gifted. But this boy, he was different, and she couldn't decide if that difference was real talent or just strange behavior. She stepped closer to him and spoke, in a calm but serious tone. "Do you know any songs?" she asked. The boy looked up slowly, thinking. His voice came out soft, almost unsure. I don't know their names." This answer only deepened her skepticism. How could someone play without knowing even one clear melody? She kept her expression flat, but inside she wondered whether the academy was wasting its time. Around the room, a few students paused their practice to listen. The red-haired girl leaned forward, whispering, "He really doesn't know anything, does he?" Her friend shrugged, trying not to smile too widely. Even some of the older students smirked, expecting the professor to lose her patience soon. The professor didn't let their reactions distract her. She had seen many hopeful beginners who made big promises but showed very little skill. They often claimed they could play by ear, but most of them simply pressed random notes and called it creativity. She feared this boy might be the same. "Play something," she said firmly. "Anything. Just show me what you can do." The boy nodded. His hands floated above the keys again, not touching them, as if he was planning his next move. His eyes scanned the keyboard like someone reading a map. The professor watched carefully. He wasn't behaving like a trained musician, but he wasn't behaving like a complete beginner either. Minutes passed, and the professor felt her patience thinning. "Are you waiting for the piano to speak to you?" One older student joked quietly, making a few others laugh. The boy flinched, but he didn't look up. Instead, he pressed one note, then another, then two together. He wasn't playing, he was testing the instrument. Like a scientist experimenting with sounds, the professor let out a small sigh. She didn't want to embarrass the boy, but she needed to know the truth. Was he really talented, or was this all just coincidence? Something in her demanded a clearer answer, something she could not get from watching him press random notes. She decided it was time for a test. She walked to the piano and gently reached over him. "Move aside for a moment," she instructed. The boy shifted, giving her space but keeping his eyes locked on her hands. She played a short, simple tune, something every beginner could follow. It was a melody she often used to evaluate new students. Smooth, slow, and predictable. Then she paused, her fingers hovering above the keys. The students knew what she was about to do. This was one of her favorite tricks, a way to check whether someone was playing by memory, by ear, or simply copying without understanding. She changed a few notes in the melody. Not obvious ones, subtle ones. Notes that most beginners wouldn't even notice were wrong. These small changes created tiny disruptions in the harmony, mistakes so delicate that only someone with a trained ear or extraordinary talent could detect them. She played the modified melody once more. The sound filled the room, familiar but slightly twisted. When she finished, she folded her hands and stepped back. "Now play it," she said to the boy. A hush fell over the room. The boy stared at the keys. His brow furrowed, not from fear, but from deep concentration. He didn't lift his hands right away. Instead, he replayed the melody in his mind, trying to grasp what he had just heard. The professor watched him closely for any sign that he understood the trick she had set. She expected confusion. She expected hesitation. She expected him to either play it completely wrong or give up halfway. That was how most untrained students reacted, but the boy did something surprising. He tilted his head as if listening to a sound only he could hear. Then he lightly tapped two keys with his fingers, testing, adjusting, correcting. The professor's eyebrows twitched. That wasn't something beginners usually did, the red-haired girl whispered. What is he doing? Her friend answered, failing, obviously. But the professor wasn't so sure anymore. The boy placed both hands on the piano. He pressed the first note soft, steady, and perfectly matching the professor's melody. Then the second note, then the third. His timing was slow but deliberate. Each note he played seemed to come after careful thought, not imitation. When he reached the part where the professor had secretly changed the tune, he paused. A long pause. The students exchanged quick glances, expecting him to stumble, but instead, the boy pressed a different key than the one he had heard from the professor. It wasn't the wrong key. It was the correct key. He fixed the professor's mistake. A ripple of shock crossed her face. For a moment she forgot to breathe. How could he know? Most trained students couldn't correct such subtle off notes, especially after hearing the tune only once. The boy continued the melody, now with perfect harmony, shaping it smoothly until the very last note. When he lifted his hands, the room was so silent it felt as if the world had stopped moving. The professor stared at him, her skepticism cracking like thin ice. This boy wasn't pretending. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't copying. He understood, and she realized, perhaps for the first time, she had seriously underestimated him. The room remained frozen for a few seconds after the boy finished playing. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the music he played had melted the noise and thoughts inside every person watching. Even the professor, who rarely showed emotion, looked genuinely shaken. She stepped closer, trying to hide the surprise on her face. Play it again, she said quietly. Her voice was softer than before, almost cautious, as if she feared the moment might break if she spoke too loudly. The boy nodded. This time he didn't pause to test the keys or measure the notes. He simply placed his fingers on the piano and let the melody flow out of him. Smooth, confident, perfect. He didn't just play the corrected tune, he made it sound better than the original version. The professor had played. Students around the room leaned forward, their disbelief growing with every note. The red-haired girl's mouth hung open. Her friend stopped whispering completely. Even the older students, who were usually too proud to admire someone younger, felt something they hadn't expected. Respect? The professor didn't say anything as he played. Her mind was racing. She had taught hundreds of students, but none had ever noticed the wrong notes in her tests so quickly. None had fixed it so effortlessly. When he finished, the last note lingered in the air like a warm breeze before fading into silence. The boy slowly lifted his hands and turned to the professor, waiting for her reaction, but she didn't speak. She walked to the side of the piano, her eyes narrowing as new thoughts formed. Her quiet skepticism from earlier was shifting into something sharper, more serious. She needed to understand how he had done it. People didn't just correct a wrong tune by accident. Not children, not beginners. The professor folded her arms and looked at him with renewed intensity. Tell me something, she said. How did you know those notes were wrong? The boy blinked, unsure how to answer. They didn't fit, he said softly. Didn't fit? She repeated. What does that mean? He hesitated. Words were hard for him. His mind didn't communicate in sounds the same way others did. For him, music wasn't just something he heard. It was something he saw in patterns, shapes, and invisible lines. But he didn't know how to explain that. It felt uneven, he finally said. Like two puzzle pieces that look the same but don't match. The professor stared at him in disbelief. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Puzzle pieces. A beginner didn't talk like that. Even experienced musicians struggled to explain harmony so simply and accurately. She walked slowly around the piano, thinking hard. Had she misjudged him? Was he playing by ear? Or was something else happening, something she hadn't seen before? The students around the room watched with huge eyes, sensing something important was happening. Attention hung in the air like a curtain waiting to be pulled open. Then suddenly, the professor made a decision. She pulled out a stack of sheet music from a small cabinet. Try this, she said, placing a complicated piece in front of him. It wasn't something a beginner could understand. It was advanced, filled with fast rhythms and difficult transitions. A few students gasped. She's testing him again, someone whispered. There's no way he can read that. The boy stared at the notes. The symbols meant nothing to him. Reading music was like reading another language, one he had never learned. The professor waited, expecting him to give up, but instead, he leaned forward. He didn't read the sheet music the way musicians did. He ignored the symbols entirely. Instead, he looked at the pattern of notes, how high or low each one sat on the staff. He didn't know their names, but he understood their distance from each other. To him it looked like a graph, like mathematical peaks and valleys. He placed his fingers on the keys. The professor's eyes widened. He was trying to play it. Slowly, he began pressing the keys one by one, following the visual pattern from the sheet. The music wasn't perfect, but it was shockingly close for someone who couldn't read notes. The rhythm stumbled, but the melody, complex and advanced, was nearly right. That's impossible, whispered the red-haired girl. He's guessing, someone muttered, but the professor knew he wasn't guessing. Guessing didn't sound like this. Guessing didn't follow patterns with such accuracy. She felt her heartbeat quicken. Something extraordinary was happening in her classroom, and she wasn't fully prepared for it. When the boy reached the end of the piece, he looked up shyly, unsure whether he had done well or terribly. The professor slowly placed her hand on the piano, steadying herself. She had set a wrong tune earlier to test him. That was her cleverness, her method of revealing fakes. But now she realized something she hadn't considered. What if he wasn't playing music the way normal people did? What if he was seeing it? What if he was understanding it through something deeper, something mathematical? The professor's gaze softened, though she tried to hide it. She was beginning to realize a truth she hadn't expected. This boy wasn't just talented. He was something entirely different, something rare, something she might never see again in her entire career, and without knowing it, she had just awakened the beginning of his story. The professor stood still for a moment, as if her mind needed extra time to catch up with everything she had just witnessed. The boy sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting on his lap, unsure if he had done something wrong or something extraordinary. His eyes moved slowly from the piano keys to the professor's face, searching for a sign, but she didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, she walked to her desk and sank into her chair, her fingers pressing against her forehead. She felt a small headache forming, not from frustration, but from something she rarely experienced, disbelief. The room remained silent. Even the students who usually whispered nonstop didn't dare say a word. They could feel the tension, the curiosity, the sense that something important was happening right in front of them. Finally, the professor looked up at the boy. "Come here," she said quietly. Her tone had changed. Earlier it was firm, almost cold. Now it held a strange gentleness, mixed with confusion and awe. The boy stood and walked toward her, his small footsteps echoing in the quiet room. She placed the sheet music in front of him again. "You played this," she said, "but you don't know how to read it. Do you?" He shook his head softly. "No." She leaned forward, her voice growing more curious than stern. "Then how did you do it?" The boy hesitated. Explaining his mind was never easy. He didn't see music like others. He didn't learn it through practice or repetition. He saw patterns. He felt connections. Notes weren't just sounds, they were steps in a sequence, like lines in a puzzle. He pointed at the music sheet. "These lines go up and down," he said slowly. "So the sounds should go up and down too." The professor stared at him. It was such a simple explanation, yet so deeply unusual. She tapped the paper. "But what about the rhythm? The timing? The spaces?" He looked at the sheet again, studying it like a math problem. "The spaces look like pauses. Some are small, some are big. So I just..." He shrugged softly. "Played them." The professor sank back in her chair. This wasn't normal. This wasn't even beginner talent. This was someone using mathematics without realizing it, someone turning visual spacing into sound. Someone translating patterns into melodies without formal training. Meanwhile, The students finally found the courage to whisper again. He figured out the sheet. Like it was math, one girl said. That doesn't make sense, her friend argued. Music isn't math. But the professor heard them and turned sharply toward them. Music is math, she said, her voice firm. Ratios, timing, frequencies, distance between notes. Everything in music follows a pattern. The students fell silent again, realizing she wasn't angry, she was astonished. She turned back to the boy. Sit again, she instructed. This time, the boy returned to the bench without hesitation. His body relaxed slightly. The piano had become a place where he felt safe, where things finally made sense. The professor took a deep breath and decided to try something more surprising. Something that would push him, something that would show her the truth. She leaned over the piano and, without warning, pressed a cluster of keys together, notes that didn't belong, notes that clashed sharply. The sound was harsh, unpleasant, like three wrong puzzle pieces forced together. The boy flinched. What do you hear? She asked softly, his eyes squeezed shut as if trying to block out the noise. It hurts, he whispered. The professor raised an eyebrow. Hurts? The boy nodded. It's uneven, like falling downstairs. Uneven, like falling downstairs. The students exchanged confused looks. Falling downstairs? What kind of description was that? But to the professor, everything suddenly became clear. He wasn't hearing music. He was feeling structure. He wasn't listening with his ears. He was listening with his mind. She pressed another set of wrong keys, different ones. The sound clashed again. The boy shook his head immediately. No, those don't match. And she pressed a beautiful chord, smooth, balanced, harmonious. The boy opened his eyes and relaxed, a small smile touching his lips. That one is right. It's like stepping on soft sand. The professor's heart thudded. She finally understood what was happening. This boy didn't know music theory, but he sensed harmony the same way mathematicians sensed symmetry. He felt patterns in the air. He understood balance instinctively. She walked around the room in slow steps, feeling a mixture of shock, excitement, and a strange sort of pride. The other students watched her nervously, unsure what she would do next. She stopped in front of the blackboard and wrote one sentence. Some minds hear music differently. Then she turned to the class. This boy, she said, pointing to him, he isn't just hearing notes. He is recognizing patterns, mathematical patterns that most trained musicians struggle to understand. The boy looked down, unsure if he was being praised or scolded. The professor softened her voice. This is not normal, she said. This is rare, very rare. A ripple of shock passed through the room. The professor walked up to the boy and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You are not learning music, she said. You are solving it. The boy blinked, confused but hopeful. The warmth in her voice felt strange, yet comforting. For the first time, he sensed that someone finally understood the way he experienced the world. And in that moment, the professor realized she had just stumbled upon something extraordinary, a child whose mind could turn notes into numbers, mistakes into corrections, and music into a language only he truly understood. The professor didn't speak for several seconds. She stood beside the piano, looking at the boy as if she had discovered a rare treasure she didn't know how to handle. Her mind was overflowing with thoughts, ideas, questions, and possibilities. But the boy sat there quietly, unaware that his life was slowly shifting in a direction he could never have imagined. She finally broke the silence. I want you to try something else, she said. Her voice had changed again, no longer strict or doubtful. Instead, it carried a tone of curiosity, almost excitement, like a scientist about to test a brilliant experiment. She reached for a notebook and flipped through pages filled with tiny symbols and numbers. It wasn't music. It wasn't even related to sound. It was a math notebook. She placed it in front of the boy. The students looked confused. Is she giving him homework? One whispered. Another nudged him. Maybe she wants to see if he's smart in other things too. The professor tapped a page filled with patterns of numbers. Do you know what these are? The boy studied the page, his fingers lightly touching the paper. The numbers didn't scare him. Numbers felt familiar, comfortable. They had always made sense to him, even when words didn't. He nodded slowly. Patterns, he whispered. The professor's eyebrows lifted slightly. Yes, patterns, but can you tell me what comes next? She pointed at a sequence. 3, 6, 12, 24. The boy didn't hesitate. 48. A few students snorted softly. Well, that was easy, one said, but the professor shook her head. Look at the next one. She turned the page and pointed at a complicated grid of numbers. This wasn't simple math. It was something she used to challenge her older students. Something that even teenagers took a few minutes to solve. The boy looked at it for only a moment before speaking. This one multiplies by 4 here, and then subtracts 3 here, and then jumps. He traced the pattern with his finger. So the next number is 21. The professor felt something close to goosebumps. This wasn't normal. This wasn't memorization. This wasn't luck. He was seeing patterns with the same clarity he saw musica, natural fluidity that made everything connect effortlessly. The students watched him differently now, not with amusement, but with awe and a little bit of fear. It was like watching someone who spoke 2 languages at once, music and math. The professor closed the notebook slowly. You have an unusual mind, she said softly. The boy looked down at his hands, unsure if it was good or bad. I just see things, he whispered. They look like shapes, or steps or waves. The professor stared at him with a mixture of wonder and realization. Music and math, she murmured. You're seeing both? At the same time? She walked toward the chalkboard again and wrote a sentence. Harmony plus pattern equals genius. The word genius made the room tremble. No teacher used that word lightly, and especially not this professor. The boy's eyes widened. I'm not a genius, he said quickly, almost afraid of the word. I'm not even good at reading. The professor turned to face him, her voice gentle. Genius doesn't always mean reading or speaking. Sometimes it means understanding the world in a way others cannot. He blinked, confused. She continued, You hear music through patterns. You understand numbers through harmony. That is rare, child, very rare. Then she leaned closer to the piano and pressed the same wrong tune she had played earlier. This time she played it slower, letting the wrong notes echo. The boy winced. That part doesn't belong there, he said softly. Why not? She asked, pushing him gently. He closed his eyes. Because the distance between those 2 notes is wrong. It's like the pattern is broken. The space should be even. The professor nodded slowly. He wasn't describing music. He was describing math. And suddenly everything about him made perfect sense. The way he listened, the way he played, the way he corrected mistakes he had never been taught to hear. The professor walked back to him, her footsteps slow and thoughtful. Listen to me carefully, she said. You may not know the names of notes or how to read sheet music or even how to write properly, but your mind works differently. He looked up at her. You are solving music the way mathematicians solve equations, she said. Your brain finds patterns everywhere, patterns most people cannot see. The boy lowered his gaze, his cheeks warming. He wasn't used to praise. Most people saw him as strange, too quiet, too distant. But this professor, she was seeing something else. The students watched silently, sensing this moment would become important, something teachers would talk about for years. The professor placed her hand on the piano again, but this time she smiled. A small smile, but a real one. I tested you, she said. On purpose, I set the wrong tune. I expected you to fail. The boy's head dropped slightly. But you didn't. He looked up again, surprised. You didn't just notice the mistake, she continued. You solved it, corrected it, improved it. The room filled with a soft, electric feeling as if a new chapter had just begun. The professor took a soft breath and said quietly, You are not learning like others. You are learning faster, and deeper, and differently. The boy swallowed nervously. Is that bad? She shook her head. It is extraordinary. And in that moment, the boy felt something he had rarely felt before. Hope. The professor stood in front of the class, her mind spinning with ideas she never thought she would consider for a child this young. She looked at the boy, small, quiet, unsure, and yet somehow brighter than anyone else in the room. She knew she could not treat him like an ordinary beginner anymore. Something inside her had shifted. She felt responsible, almost protective. "Come with me," she said gently. The boy blinked, a little startled. "Where?" "To the practice room." A few students exchanged surprised looks. The practice room was not for beginners. It was for advanced students, those who were preparing for concerts, exams, or competitions. Beginners were never allowed in there. The red-haired girl whispered, "Why is he going?" Her friend shook his head. "I think she wants to test him even more." But the professor wasn't testing him anymore. She was trying to understand him. The boy followed her down the hallway. His steps were small and careful, and he kept glancing back at the other students staring after him. He felt nervous. He didn't like when people watched him, and he didn't understand why the professor was treating him differently now. They reached a large door. The professor unlocked it, and the boy stepped inside. The practice room was bigger than the other classrooms. The walls were covered with soundproof panels, and several instruments, violins, cellos, flutes were neatly placed on stands. In the center stood a beautiful grand piano, larger and shinier than the one in the main hall. The boy gasped softly. The professor noticed. "You like this one?" He nodded, unable to look away from the piano. "Then sit," she said. He walked toward the piano as if walking toward a dream. When he sat at the bench, his fingers hovered over the keys, not touching them, just feeling their presence. His eyes softened. This piano sounded even before he played it, at least in his mind. "Before you play anything," the professor said, sitting opposite him, "I want to ask you something." The boy looked up. "How do you hear music?" He didn't understand the question. "I hear it with my ears." The professor shook her head slowly. "No, you don't hear it like other children do. You sense it differently." "I want to know how." He stared at the piano keys, trying to find the right words. "When someone plays a song," he said softly, "I don't hear. Only the sound. I see shapes, like hills and waves, and sometimes stairs. Stairs. Stairs?" The professor repeated, fascinated. He nodded. "Some notes are like stepping up. Some are stepping down. And when someone plays it wrong, the steps are broken." The professor felt goosebumps. He wasn't describing music, he was describing mathematical graphs. Frequencies, sound waves, in the simplest, most innocent way. This child wasn't just talented. He was gifted with a completely different perception of sound. She took a deep breath. "All right," she said softly. "I want you to play something. Not a song, just something that feels right to you." The boy hesitated. "Anything?" "Yes, anything." He closed his eyes, and then his fingers touched the keys. What came out wasn't a song he had heard before. It wasn't even something he had practiced. It was a melody born in that moment, a strange, beautiful mix of high and low notes that flowed together like water. It was simple, but it carried emotion. Soft emotion. A feeling of loneliness, curiosity, and hope all at once. The professor inhaled sharply. She heard something in his music that she had never heard from any child before. Authentic, raw expression. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling a story without words, using patterns instead of sentences. The boy continued to play, his face calm, his mind somewhere far away. Every note was chosen with care, like he was solving an emotional equation. Sometimes the tune rose like a question. Sometimes it fell like a quiet answer. The professor felt her chest tighten. She wasn't expecting to feel anything. She was a teacher, trained to analyze, not to be moved. But this touched her. It touched something deep. When the boy finally stopped, the room was silent again. He looked at the professor nervously. "Was it okay?" The professor swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to tell him it was beautiful. She wanted to tell him she had never heard anything like it. But she controlled herself. "It was more than okay," she said softly. "It was honest." The boy didn't know what that meant, but the warmth in her voice made him smile a little. The professor leaned forward. "I have taught for many years," she said quietly, "and I have never met someone who plays like you. You listen differently. You think differently. And that means you must learn differently." The boy's smile faded slightly. Learn differently? Yes, she said. You will learn music the same way you understand patterns. Through connections. Through shapes. Through the way your mind naturally works. He looked down at his hands, feeling something strange, something heavy, but exciting. Can I really learn? The professor's expression softened. You can learn more than you think. She stood up and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. From today, she said, I will teach you myself. The boy froze. He had never been chosen before. Never been seen. Never been believed in. His eyes sparkled, and the professor, seeing that spark, finally realized the truth. She wasn't training a normal student. She was nurturing a prodigy. The next morning, the academy felt different. The boy walked through the hallway with the same quiet steps as before, but something inside him had changed. Yesterday he had entered as a shy beginner. Today, he entered as a student chosen by the professor herself, something that had never happened in the academy's history. The other students stared at him as he passed. Some with curiosity, some with jealousy, and some with respect they didn't want to admit. The red-haired girl, who had giggled on the first day, now watched him with a puzzled expression. How did someone like him get chosen? She whispered. Her friend shrugged. Professor never picks anyone. That means he's special? The boy didn't hear their whispers. Oh, maybe he did, but he didn't understand why they mattered. His mind was focused on one thing, the piano room and the promise the professor had made when he entered the practice room. The professor was already there, sitting beside the grand piano with a notebook in her hand. She looked up as he walked in, and for the first time she smiled at him. Not a big smile, but a gentle, welcoming one. You came early, she said. I didn't want to be late, the boy replied softly. Good, she said. We have much to learn today. He sat at the piano, his legs dangling slightly above the floor. The professor observed him closely. She saw how his eyes softened when he looked at the keys, how his fingers hovered with natural confidence, how he sat with a focus that many older students lacked today. She wanted to understand him even more. We're going to try something new, she said. She placed a blank sheet of paper on the stand. No notes, no symbols, nothing. The boy looked confused. What should I play? Nothing yet, she said. First tell me what you feel when you look at this page. He blinked. It's empty. Exactly, she replied. Now imagine you could fill it with sound. What would you put first? The boy hesitated. No one had ever asked him a question like that. Create something? From nothing? He closed his eyes. Inside his mind, patterns began to form, not notes, but shapes. Gentle curves, rising lines, little dips like soft breaths. He didn't think in musical terms. He saw waves slow and calm. He opened his eyes and pressed a soft note. The professor leaned forward. Another note followed. Then another. The melody that formed wasn't fancy or fast. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, pure, like a quiet morning breeze that whispered rather than sang. The professor felt her heart soften. Do you know what you're doing? She asked. No, he said honestly. I'm just, following the shapes. Exactly as she expected. You're creating your own music, she said quietly. The boy's eyes widened. Me? Yes, she said. You? He stared at the keys, astonished. He had never believed he could create anything on his own. He always thought music belonged to people who could read it, write it, or name it. But now he was making something real. As he played, the professor watched the way his fingers moved. They didn't move like beginners. They didn't even move like trained students. There was a fluidity in the way he shifted from one note to the next, like someone solving a puzzle in real time. His hands moved in patterns, not positions. The professor began taking notes. She wrote down every observation, how he paused before certain intervals, how he leaned closer when he sensed a harmonic imbalance, how he corrected himself instinctively. Finally, she closed the notebook and stood. Enough for now, she said softly. You did very well. The boy lowered his hands, unsure whether to smile or stay quiet. Can I learn real music too? He asked. The kind from books? The professor shook her head, not to reject him, but to correct him. You already understand something deeper than what books can teach, she said. But yes, you will learn that too. In time, she walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a book. It was old, worn from years of use, filled with the foundations of music theory. She placed it in front of him. This, she said, is how most students begin. The boy looked at the pages, full of symbols he didn't understand. But you, she continued, can begin here. She opened the book to a far more advanced page, something she taught only to her top students. The boy stared at her, shocked. But I don't know any of this? You don't need to know it yet, she said. You need to feel it first. Understand it your way? He ran his fingers across the page, not reading it but sensing it, as if searching for the hidden math inside the music. The professor watched him with a calm smile. Music has rules, she said. But geniuses don't start with rules. They start with curiosity. He lifted his eyes. Am I really a genius? The professor knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his back. You are something even more rare, she said. You are a thinker. A creator. A mind that sees the world differently. The boy swallowed hard, his heart swelling with a warmth he had never felt before. Confidence. From today, the professor said, we will build something new together, a kind of music that belongs only to you. And for the first time in his life, the boy believed that maybe, just maybe, he truly had a place in the world. The day of the recital arrived sooner than anyone expected. The academy buzzed with excitement. Parents filled the long hallway, adjusting cameras and greeting each other. Students in neat clothes practiced their pieces nervously, repeating scales under their breath. It was a special event, an annual showcase where the best young musicians performed for the first time on stage. But this year, something was different. There was a new name on the program, a name no one had seen before, a name that didn't belong to any competition winner or long-trained student. It was the boy's. He stood backstage, holding his fingers together, trying to calm his trembling hands. Though he had learned so much in the past weeks, he still felt unsure. He didn't know if he deserved to be here among students with years of training. What if I make mistakes? He whispered to himself. What if they laugh at me? What if the professor was wrong about me? The professor stood beside him, sensing his fear. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Are you nervous? He nodded silently. She leaned down so their eyes were level. Do you know something interesting? She said softly. Every great musician in history has felt exactly what you're feeling right now. Nervousness doesn't mean you're not ready. It means you care. He swallowed hard. But what if I forget everything? You won't, she said with confidence. Because you aren't playing from memory. You're playing from your mind, from your patterns, from your way of seeing the world. No one else can play your music because no one else is you. The boy took a slow breath. Her words felt like a warm blanket around his fear. Finally, his turn came. The announcer said his name, and the audience turned their heads, expecting someone impressive, someone tall, confident, experienced. Instead, the boy stepped onto the stage, small and quiet. Wearing a simple shirt and nervous eyes, a whisper traveled through the crowd. Who is he? I've never seen him before. Is he new? He looked scared. The professor watched from backstage, her heart pounding, not with worry, but with pride. The boy walked to the grand piano at the center of the stage. He sat on the bench, his feet dangling just above the floor. For a brief moment he froze. The lights were bright, the silence heavy. Every eye was on him. He closed his eyes, and then he saw them. The patterns, soft waves, rising steps, gentle curves, shapes only he understood. The shapes that had helped him all along. The shapes that made music feel like home. He placed his hands on the piano, and he began to play. The first notes were quiet, like a shy whisper. But the sound was pure, so pure that it reached every corner of the hall. People leaned forward instinctively. Parents stopped their quiet conversations. Children paused mid-breath. Then the melody grew. Not loud, not fast, but deep, thoughtful, the kind of music that didn't show off skill, but emotion. Each note rolled into the next like pieces of a story he didn't know how to tell with words. He played the shapes he saw, the rising lines that felt like hope, the falling ones that felt like questions, the soft curves that felt like memories he didn't fully understand. The audience listened, spellbound. The professor felt tears gather in her eyes, not of the sadness, but from a realization blooming inside her. This wasn't just talent. This was something untouched, untrained, unbroken, a gift as rare as sunrise on a foggy morning. The boy continued to play with his eyes closed, letting his mind guide his hands. His small body swayed slightly with the rhythm, like he was part of the music, not separate from it. When the last note faded into the air, silence filled the room again, a deep, heavy silence. Then suddenly, the entire hall erupted into applause, not polite applause, not hesitant. Applause, thunderous applause, the kind that shakes the heart. The boy opened his eyes, shocked. He looked around at the clapping crowd, unsure how to react. People were standing, smiling, cheering. They weren't laughing, they weren't doubting. They were amazed. The professor walked onto the stage and stood beside him, proud and moved. She placed her hand gently behind his back. "You did it," she whispered. "I did?" the boy asked, still unsure. She nodded. "You didn't just play music? You touched people." He looked at the audience again, mothers wiping tears, fathers nodding in admiration, students staring with wide eyes for the first time in his life. The boy felt seen. The professor knelt beside him and whispered something he would remember forever. "You didn't fit into the world's tune," she said. "So you created your own? That is what true genius is." The boy felt warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he could not describe but understood deeply. From that day on, the academy didn't just see him as a student. They saw him as a musician, a mathematician of sound, a creator of harmony, a quiet boy who turned patterns into feelings, and a professor who almost missed discovering a genius until she realized that sometimes the wrong tune leads to the right person.